So here's the plan. I'm going to start by just reading you an excerpt from the introduction to the book. And that'll last maybe 10 minutes, something like that. And then I'd like to turn to the slides and give you just a little bit of a sense of the science on which the book is based. I think you'll hear even in the introductory material that the book is more than just about science. It's also about my family growing up. It's kind of a weird genre of books that is about 30 years of scientific research, but set against a backdrop of my own experience in my own biological family growing up. So we'll do that, and then we'll open it up for questions, and I will really love to hear your questions and comments about the material that I present to you. So, an excerpt from the introduction. What if the children about whom we worry most were actually those with the greatest promise? What if those youth whose lives are marked by turmoil and difficulty were plausibly heirs to the brightest, most creative futures? What if seemingly blighted and troubled childhoods could give way under conditions of encouragement and support to adulthoods bearing not simply normal lives and passable achievement, but deep, rich relationships and inspired accomplishment? What if even the very real burdens of a child's uncommon fragility could be reshaped under responsive conditions into the tangible advantages of human resilience? What if, in short, the apparent frailties and disarray of some young lives were redeemable through the alchemy of nurturing families or communities and transformative care? This book is the story of just such a surprising redemption. It is a narrative mined from a body of child development research and from a near lifetime of careful watching by a once young pediatrician who became, by blessing and luck, a father, a grandfather, and in the end, a grizzled and well-marinated counselor of children and families. The story, at once scientific and personal, is offered as a gift of encouragement and hope for all those who teach, protect, care for, raise, or worry over children, as well as those who have struggled since childhood to understand the origin of their own affliction with human differences. If your life resembles my own to any degree, you have fretted incessantly over your children's well-being and future and have long pondered how their strivings and trials may stem in some manner from your own. You have likely thrilled at their triumphs and masteries, lived for their affections, taken pride in their accomplishments, and brooded over their troubles and sorrows. But the pain of a parent whose son or daughter has gone seriously adrift into drug abuse, delinquency, depression, or allegiances to destructive friendships is an anxiety of an entirely different order. Watching as a child strays perilously off course and begins to sustain the feared, often indelible consequences of departure from a healthy life is the kind of parental apprehension that is almost physically sensed. It is the pit in the stomach, the panicked, slightly nauseous desperation and dread that disallows sleep, becomes a preoccupation at work, and can erode even the strongest of marriages through miscommunication, acrimony, and disappointment. Watching a child slip away into the dark territory of serious psychological troubles, addiction, school failure, or criminality is an agony almost beyond description. Though never having sustained this level of worry as a parent, I have had a direct and indelibly memorable encounter with such anguish through much of my life because of my sister, about whom more is to follow. Among the most fervent ambitions of this book is to offer solace and hope to just such anguished families, to the parents, teachers, siblings, and others who have lost their confidence in the retrievable promise of a child or children, and to those whose belief in a child's inherent goodness and potential has been shaken. For in the story of the figure of speech from which this book draws its enigmatic title, the metaphor of orchid and dandelion, lies a deep and often helpful truth about the origins of affliction and the redemption of individual lives. Most children in our families, classrooms, or communities are more or less like dandelions. They prosper and thrive almost anywhere they're planted. Like dandelions, these are the majority of children whose well-being is all but assured by their constitutional hardiness and strength. There are others, however, who, more like orchids, can wither and fade when unattended by caring support, but who, also like orchids, can become creatures of rare beauty, complexity, and elegance when met with compassion and kindness. While a conventional but arguably deficient wisdom has held that children are either vulnerable or resilient to the trials that the world presents them, what our research and that of others has increasingly revealed is that the vulnerability-resilience contrast is a false or at least misleading dualism. It is a flawed dichotomy that attributes weakness or strength, frailty or vigor to individual subgroups of youth and obscures a deeper reality that children simply differ, like orchids and dandelions, in their susceptibilities and sensitivities to the conditions of life that surround and sustain them. Most of our children can, like dandelions, thrive in all but the harshest, most bestial circumstances, but a minority of others, like orchids, either blossom beautifully or wane disappointingly, depending upon how we tend and spare and care for them. This is the redemptive secret the story herein reveals, that those orchid children who founder and fail can as easily become those who enliven and thrive in singular ways. In the end, it is not vulnerability, but sensitivity that defines the orchid child. And when given the right support, that sensitivity can blossom into lives of great joy, success, and beauty. As I map out the defining features of orchid lives, I will also reflect upon those of us more aligned with the dandelion's way of being, and will take note of how essential, how vital such individuals are to what George Eliot referred to as the growing good of the world. Though distinctive in several dimensions, dandelions have their own life struggles and challenges that will be important to understand and define. We will also discover that beneath the serviceable categories of orchid and dandelion lies the truer reality of a continuum, a spectrum of sensitivities to the world, along which we all have a place. In the end, it will be the remarkable complementarity of orchids and dandelions that we will want to sustain and remember. The usefulness and often love of the one for the other, the symmetry and mutuality of their symphonic roles in human discourse and history, and their coevolution as distinctive but equally cogent solutions to the deep dilemmas life calls forth. More illustrative of the broader concerns of this book, however, is the reality that it is the children of our societies who are the most sensitive and susceptible of all those who lack power, the most dependent among those who rely vitally upon grace and beneficence for survival. It is our children who are incapable of providing for themselves, who cannot stand alone without protection or help, who are the most vulnerable to the failings and indiscretions of nations. Though orchid children are, as we will see in the pages to come, those especially responsive and tender to the manner in which we treat and protect our young. At the larger scale of human societies and populations, it is all children who are the orchids of the world. So that's a little bit of the introduction. And let me turn now to telling you a little bit about the 30-plus years of science that really went into those conclusions as that science emerged over those decades of time. So, the orchid and the dandelion, why some children struggle and how all can thrive. All of us in our lives have what I think of as deep currents. If you're a sailor on Lake Michigan, wherever that is at this point, you know that there are surface forces that guide and direct and limit the directionality of your boat. You know that there are winds of different velocities from different points of the compass. You know that there are seas that are either big or small. You know that there are these surface currents and whitecaps and other disruptions of the current of that water. But then in addition to that, there are these deep currents that move underneath that surface and are really kind of the major forces that guide and direct a boat out on water. And I think it's the same with human lives. We all have the things that perturb our lives and alter our directions from day to day, week to week, month to month. But then there are these powerful undercurrents that guide us and direct us and tell us who we are in many ways. These are present in every human life, and I suspect in all of yours. And for me, one of the major ones of these deep currents is the fact that I've, for 4 decades of time, been a pediatrician scientist focused upon children and on young families who are facing stress and trauma and major adversity. That has been kind of the most prominent and most driving force within my academic and professional career. But there's a second major theme which in my life, which is represented in this snapshot from many, many years ago. This is me at age about, I would guess, 7 or thereabouts. And this is my sister Mary, who was at the time 5 and a kindergartner. Mary and I were as alike in temperament and interest and intelligence as 2 siblings are allowed by their genetics and their families to be. We were very close. We were each was the other's best playmate. We were our closest friends, particularly in early life when this particular snapshot was taken. We were 2 kids being raised in the same family with very, very similar temperaments, personalities, skills, assets, liabilities. And yet, as we grew up and as life continued, there was a divergence in what happened to the 2 of us. My life really became, I like to think of my having a life of almost shameful, almost embarrassing good fortune. I had a gratifying and productive professional career. I have a stable 45-year marriage to my wife, who's back there. I'll try not to blind her. We have 2 thriving children, one of whom is on the Northwestern faculty here and lives in Chicago, and the other lives in Oakland, California. And we have 4 grandsons, all under 5, which is, you can imagine what kind of a carnival that is. So a really wonderful life that I am deeply grateful for. In contrast to that, my sister's life was a life of disappointment and affliction, I think it would be honest to say. She developed juvenile rheumatoid arthritis at age 11, a chronic, in some people, crippling disease. She then began to have a variety of mental health symptoms that just amplified as she went through her adolescence. And by age 20, she carried a diagnosis of schizophrenia. She, as a graduate student at Harvard, had an accidental pregnancy, decided to keep that child, and delivered a birth asphyxiated and ultimately disabled little girl who's now 40. And she had a series of ongoing severe mental disorders throughout her life. So 2 kids, really remarkably similar, in the same family, on the beaches of Southern California, for what that's worth, whose lives pursued these ever distancing kinds of trajectories. And for me, the question has always been why. And one of really the second deep current of my life was trying to understand why it is that happened, and how does that happen? What's the biology that underlies it? How can we understand that as pediatricians and scientists? Now, you all know that there are a huge variety of factors that go into the health and wellness or disease of children. There are infections that we worry about. Ear infections and respiratory disease are the bread and butter of pediatrics. There are toxins that kids are exposed to, physical toxins and poisons. There is the goodness, the nutritiousness of the diet that the child consumes. There is the question of access to health care, how easily or with difficulty the child accesses health care. Housing issues. Is this a child that's growing up in a well-to-do, advantaged neighborhood or a disadvantaged home? There is violence, both in the family and outside of the family and the neighborhood, that profoundly affect children. There's parenting difficulties. There are great parents, and there are parents who struggle with their parenting. And there is, of course, poverty, which is the single most powerful predictor of child health that we know of. It's so powerful that we, for many, many years, didn't even study it because it was just always there. We controlled for it. But in the last 30 or 40 years, we've begun to actually study the effect of poverty. But the one that's missing, the one factor that is missing from this set of risk factors for children's health and development is this one, which we have tended to overlook, and which I would argue, and I want to convince you tonight, is one of the most prevalent, profound, and powerful exposures that children can sustain. And that is the exposure to emotional trauma, adversity, stressors in the lives of young children on up through adolescence. And I would argue that there is now within our nation and in North America truly an epidemic of childhood trauma and what we have come to call adverse childhood events, or ACEs. Many of you may be familiar with that term. And these are the things listed here, things like physical, emotional, and sexual maltreatment of children, all too common, intimate partner or community violence, apparent substance abuse or a parent's mental disorder, the death of a parent or a caretaker, parental divorce, certainly one of the more prevalent ACEs that children are exposed to, parent incarceration, being raised by a single unsupported parent, the poverty and unemployment that I mentioned earlier, and natural disasters. All of these are these adverse childhood events that exert powerful, powerful effects on the emotional well-being of children. And they are tremendously common. And in fact, the epidemiologic evidence now is that if we look at any given population of children, a community, a state, a nation, within that population of children, 2/3 of those children and adolescents will have experienced a potentially traumatic event or childhood adversity by the age of 16. 2/3. It's almost so prevalent a risk factor that it's hard to even see that it's there. It's like the analogy that I use is if we all smoked 2 packs of cigarettes a day, everybody here smoked 2 packs of cigarettes a day, we would conclude that lung cancer was a genetic disease. And in a sense, we'd be right, because all of the variability in lung cancer would come from the differences in genetic susceptibility to that disease. So the risk factors that are the most difficult to detect and see are those that are the most common. In the example or the analogy of lung cancer, it's that everybody smokes. In the real world of childhood, it is this adversity and ACEs that are so prevalent in the lives of so many children. And it's important, too, that we recognize two aspects of this prevalence of ACEs. This slide shows on the vertical axis here is the percentage of children who are experiencing these various adversities within their environments: housing density, other housing problems, noise in the ambient environment, family turmoil and chaos, and violence, either within the family or within the community. And you can see that if we divide the sample into those who are being raised in impoverished circumstances versus those who are being raised in middle-income, advantaged families and communities, that it is always the case that those being raised in disadvantage have higher prevalences of these exposures relative to middle-income children. That's the major conclusion from these set of data. But the other one I want you to also take note of is that these other prevalences in middle-income children and families are not zero. Middle-income children are also exposed to violence in the family and in the community. They experience family turmoil and chaos. So it's not as if these adversities that we're talking about are events that are completely divided socioeconomically. There are children, even within the most well-to-do communities, for which adversity and adverse childhood events are extremely pertinent, extremely important, and predictive of the outcomes that they will have. Why do we care about adversity? This slide just shows evidence that significant adversity impairs child development in the first 3 years. Those first 3 critical years that we now know are the most predictive of how children are going to do over the longer haul. It's not that the things that happen to you in adolescence are not also important, or in middle childhood, or even in adulthood. But those first 3 years, we now know from neuroscience and the science of child development, are the critical period of time where the events that happen, the exposures to which children are subjected, have powerful effects. So here is shown the percentage of children with developmental delays as a function of the number of risk factors going from 1 or 2 up to 7. These are the ACEs that we've been talking about. And you can see that there is this monotonic, linear, stepwise increase as the number of ACEs increase. The percentage of children with developmental delays increases concomitantly. So one reason we're concerned about this is because it impairs development. We also know that ACEs and trauma impair mental health as well. And this slide shows the mental health consequences of adverse childhood events. Here on the vertical axis is the lifetime history of depressive disorders, mood disorders like clinical depression. Horizontal axis, the number of ACEs. And again, you see this stepwise increase with those at the highest level of the ACEs scale having the highest percentage of those with a lifetime history of depressive disorders. So there are also mental health consequences of adverse childhood events. But the exposure to adversity in childhood, it's, the saying about what happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas. What happens in childhood doesn't stay in childhood. The things that we experience, especially in those first 3 years of life, echo back in our health and our well-being and our development, our productivity, our well-being of our lives on into adulthood. And one manifestation of that is the development of risk factors for adult coronary heart disease, which are also embedded in adverse childhood events. So you're familiar with this now. Here is again the adverse life experiences, adverse childhood events, the odds of developing adult heart disease, and again there is this increase over this, the spectrum from 0 to 7 or 8 adverse experiences. So these things that happen in childhood are not contained in childhood. They continue on into adulthood, affecting things as fundamental as inflammatory disease on into adulthood, heart disease, other forms of chronic disease, and even longevity. We also know that early stress exposures can affect even the structure of neurons in the central nervous system, in the brain. We know this, of course, from animal models, not from children. It's very difficult and really impossible to study in children. But we know from animal models, animal experiments, that if we compare the structure of a neuron within the brain of an experimental animal, and we compare that to an animal that has sustained early severe stress in the first few weeks of life, in the case of a rodent, which is where these neurons come from, that we see in this neuron a variety of different structural changes. There's a diminished and simplified branching. You can see that this is just a simpler, less complex neuron relative to this one. There are decreases in the points of attachment, the little points on the axon, the dendrites, where attachment between neurons can occur. And there is even shrinkage of the cell body right here compared to right here. So these visible structural differences in the neurons that come from an animal that has been stressed substantially in early life versus those who have had a normative childhood and early developmental period. But there's a little secret here. I've been showing you these bar graphs of these stepwise linear increases in various kinds of outcomes that we want to try to prevent. We want to try to prevent delays in development, in depressive disorders, in coronary heart disease risk in adults. All of these I've shown you have these stepwise increases in prevalence as adversity exposures increase. But the little secret is this, that if you look at the actual data points of the individual children that underlie these kinds of associations, it looks like this. Pretty remarkable. Here's still the same linear gradient with depression, mental health problems increasing as a function of ACEs scores. But when you look at the individual data points that go into that association, it looks like a shotgun has hit the screen. There are kids who have these huge ACEs scores and who have no depressive symptoms at all, and there are other kids who have almost no ACEs and yet have these high depression scores, and they develop PTSD and more severe mental health disorders. So there is this extraordinary variability in every one of those associations that I showed you. Lots and lots of variety in how individual children have responded to their experiences of their own ACEs. Now, we began years ago saying, this is really important. We've been trying to get all the noise out of the system by using better psychometric instruments, by doing more elegant experiments with children, by more detailed observations, bigger samples of children. And all the way along, we continue to find this kind of amazing variation. The association's still there, to be sure, but amazing variation and noise in that association. So we began about now, 25 years ago, starting to ask whether the variability in developmental outcomes by adversity, whether it really is noise or whether it might actually be the music. It might actually be what we need to be looking at. It might be the core of the phenomenon of trauma and stress in the lives of children. And we began to ask, maybe what we need to be studying is the variation in children's responsivity to these kinds of traumatic challenges and stressors that they experience. So how would we study that? Well, we studied that, we began to study that about 25 years ago by bringing children into a laboratory setting, set them down in front of an examiner that they'd never met before, hooked them up to a variety of physiologic monitoring devices, electrodes on their chests, sometimes EEG on their heads, blood pressure cuffs, had them spit to give us saliva for measuring cortisol. And we had them go through a series of mildly stressful but challenging tasks. These were not things that were terribly, terribly stressful. We learned very quickly that children just won't do things that are really stressful. The adult literature on stress reactivity up until that point 25 years ago was based on experiments with adults where adults were asked to put their hands into ice water. And they had to keep their hands in ice water for a minute or two. If you've ever done that, it is really painful. Really painful, and it drives up blood pressure and heart rate, it activates the cortisol system and so on. We tried that with children. They put their hands in. 20 seconds later, they pulled it out and said, that hurts. I'm not going to do that. So we had to find these stressors, these challenges that were just enough to cause a biological response to the challenge, but not so challenging that it caused them to cry or run out of the room or whatever. So we were doing this, and we were studying the two principal stress response systems in the human brain. And those are the cortisol system, which is centered here in the hypothalamus of the brain, right in the very center of the brain, just above the pituitary, and the fight or flight system, which is initiated here in this little structure in the brainstem called the locus of ceruleus. The cortisol system we're all familiar with because hydrocortisone is what we put on rashes. Cortisol is a powerful stress hormone. It affects the immune system. It has powerful effects on cardiovascular functioning as well. And the fight or flight system is the system, the autonomic nervous system, that gives us sweaty palms when we're nervous about something, or makes us just a little bit tremulous, or dilates the pupils of our eyes when we're in a stressful or challenging circumstance. So all of these autonomically mediated phenomena are from the fight or flight system, which begins right here in that little nucleus. And we took our turns at measuring both the cortisol system and the fight or flight system as children were going through these procedures and challenges within the lab. And again, these are very scripted, very standardized challenges. So they really didn't vary from one child to another, to another, to another. I should tell you what they actually were, since I've gone out of my way to tell you that we were looking for things that were not too stressful. They were things like the examiner would say, I'm going to repeat a span of 5 digits, and I want you to repeat them back to me. And kids would have to, repeat back the digits, and it would get harder as the little sub-test went on. We would put a drop of lemon juice on the child's tongue, which is amazingly evocative of increases in heart rate and all kinds of physiologic parameters that we were measuring at the time. We would just do a simple interview with this examiner that the child had never met before, asking about the child's birthday and their family and what kind of presents they got on their birthday. All things that are kind of normative social exchanges, but are challenging by virtue of the fact that it's an older adult that you haven't met before who is asking you these questions. So there were things like that. They were stressors, but they were minor. So here's what the data actually looked like. We were measuring these individual differences in children's biological responses to stress and challenge. And what we found was that many of the children in our laboratory looked like this. This just shows, for the purposes of illustration, mean arterial pressure, which is the average of the systolic and the diastolic pressure. This is time. This is the challenging tasks, 1 through 5, that occurred over time. And this shows here that the blood pressures of these children were relatively low, nothing surprising or disconcerting, and they were relatively invariant. There wasn't a lot of variation from one task to another. In contrast to that, there were other children, a smaller group, who looked like this. They had blood pressures that were substantially higher than these children, and as important, they had highly variable blood pressures. They just went up and down, up and down. And this was true in all of the different cardiovascular parameters that we measured in the course of this protocol. So we had these interesting differences, these extremes in variability and in magnitude of the children's responses as measured in these peripheral physiologic parameters. So now we had these measures in the laboratory. We had an actual measure of a standardized biological response of a child to things that we asked them to do. And what we then could do was to take those measures and move them into the real world, where children are confronted daily with challenges that are probably substantially more perturbing, more upsetting than the things that we asked them to do in the lab. And we could begin studying the effect of those real-world stressors on the kinds of health outcomes that we were concerned with. So, for example, we could look at low stress and high stress naturally occurring conditions, either in the home or the community or the school, and we could look at outcomes like behavioral disorders, pre-syndromal psychopathology, if you will, depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms, things of that kind, or serious respiratory disease. How many pneumonias and asthma and bronchitis did we see in the children who were in these two different kinds of conditions? So in a sense, we were taking the laboratory measures and moving them into the real world, the natural world of the child. And here's what the data looked like. These children who had shown low and relatively invariant mean arterial pressures in low naturally occurring stress conditions versus high stress conditions, there's virtually no difference. There's a little bit of increase here in these outcomes that we care about, but there's really very little to talk about here. These kids had just about the same levels of outcomes that we would like to prevent, either in low stress or high stress conditions in the real world. But by contrast to that, these other children had strikingly different results. These kids who had the higher and more variant physiologic parameters in the laboratory conditions, in the high stress conditions, they had the worst outcomes of any of the children in our studies. They had more in the way of behavioral problems, they had more serious respiratory disease, they had more injuries. Everything that we measured, these kids had the worst outcomes when they were existing and being reared within high-stress families, schools, or communities. But the interesting thing was, this is what we had hypothesized, but what we hadn't hypothesized and what took us completely by surprise, and we kept finding it in study after study after study, was that these kids in low-stress, predictable, nurturant conditions actually had the lowest rates of these untoward outcomes. They were the healthiest children of all the children in our samples. So here was a subgroup of kids who had either the worst or the best outcomes, depending upon the kind of social setting in which they were nested. So we had these outcomes. I was, years ago, presenting these kinds of results to a group at Stanford University down the peninsula. And at the end of the talk, this old guy came down an aisle like this, old guy with a gnarly, twisted cane, and he came up to me and shook the cane at me and said, "You're talking about Mas Crossbarn." And I said, "I am? I don't know what that is." It turns out he was Swedish, and it turns out that there is an idiomatic Swedish expression, Mas Crossbarn, which means in Swedish, dandelion child. And what the Swedes mean by that phrase is that these are children, there are some children who, like the dandelion, can be raised anywhere. They're like these kids. They're unperturbed by high, naturally occurring adversities and traumas. So we began, of course, calling these orchid children. And the next step was, of course, to say, well, these then must be orchid children. If the children who have very little change in bad outcomes under high stress conditions are the dandelions, then these must be the Orchidbarn, the orchid children in Swedish. We've been able over the years to replicate these findings in a variety of experimental animal settings. My favorite of these, and this really goes from everything from non-human primates down to fruit flies, where we've been able to show exactly the same thing. But I had the good fortune of spending a year at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, where there is a natural 6-acre natural habitat where a troop of rhesus macaques abides. Lucky group of 40 to 50 animals who have a habitat which includes lots of toys for monkeys to play with. It has lots of space. It has a pond in the middle of it, and it has an island in the middle of the pond and a bridge going over to the island. It is really it's like a summer camp for monkeys. It's a wonderful place for a troop of animals to live. However, right before I had come to the NIH for that year, there had been a planned reconstruction on the habitat site. There were things that needed to be altered. And so for that period of time of reconstruction, they had to herd all of these animals, 40 or 50 animals, into a 200 square foot cinder block building, which normally functioned as the shelter during thunderstorms and bad rain and snow and so on. The animals would gather in there temporarily to get out of the weather. But for what was billed as a 2-month period of time, these animals would have to be confined to this very small space together. And that doesn't work well with a troop of very fierce rhesus macaques. Animals start getting hurt in those circumstances. And of course, the 2-month period turned out to be 6 months. So it was this long half-year period of confinement that turned out to be exceedingly stressful for this troop of animals. But here was a natural experiment where we could actually look at what happened to these animals before, during, and after that confinement. So this shows, this is going to show low stress conditions, the kind of way things were before the confinement and after the confinement. This is the confinement conditions. Again, this is like the naturally occurring low stress and high stress environments of the children that I've shown you before. These are violent injuries. The incidence of injuries at the hands and claws and fangs of another animal within the troop over the period of time of confinement. And this is what those data looked like. There were dandelion monkeys that had virtually no increase in violent injuries under the confinement conditions at all. And there was a smaller subgroup of animals who had the very worst, had terrible, terrible injuries. And in fact, one of the animals was mobbed, as they call it, by the troop during the confinement period and died. There was an animal who actually died of the injuries during this period of time. And those animals not only had the worst of the violent injuries under the confinement, they were the most protected and least injured during the periods before and after that confinement. So dandelion and orchid macaques. And they had shown earlier that these animals that looked like orchids in this set of data were highly reactive monkeys physiologically when tested in laboratory circumstances. So, who are these orchids and dandelion children? Who are they? 80% of kids that we test in our lab are dandelion children, as we would term them. They have minimally responsive stress reactive systems. That cortisol system and the fight or flight system are minimally reactive. Clinically, when I see these children in our clinical program, they are often extroverted, they're outgoing, they're extroverted kinds of kids. They move easily into novelty. New circumstances do not perturb them. They do not withdraw from that. And they have that kind of average health under both low stress and high stress conditions in their natural worlds. In contrast to that, clinically, about 20% of kids are these orchid children who have highly responsive, highly reactive stress response systems in the brain. They are often shy, not universally shy, but they often are shy kids. They tend to withdraw from novel circumstances. They don't like going to, birthday parties where they don't know the other kids. They like to be in circumstances that are predictable, understandable, and they can deal with. They often have sensory sensitivities. I mentioned that my wife and I have two kids. Our son, Andrew, who's here on the Northwestern faculty, is definitely a dandelion, but our daughter was really down at the orchid end of the scale. Amy would have these great difficulties with having wrinkles in her socks inside of her shoe. She couldn't stand having a shoe on with her socks wrinkled inside. She had taste aversions. She had some problems with noise. So these kind of sensory hypersensitivities are also characteristic of these orchid children. And they have this fascinating characteristic of having either the best outcomes or the worst outcomes, depending upon the kind of family and school and environment in which they are reared. Important that I mention, however, that these are not two wastebaskets into which all children can be deposited. It really is a spectrum. It is a true U-shaped or inverse U-shaped curve. Many children are right in the middle, but there are children who are at the extreme who look very much like the orchid profile that I've just mentioned, and there are others who at the other extreme look very much like dandelions. The fancy scientific name that we give to this is differential neurobiologic susceptibility to social context. And over the years, we have studied this at the level of temperament and behavior. I've shown you the data on cortisol and fight or flight reactivity. We've also studied it at the level of brain circuitry and synapse and cell. And we are now studying it at the level of genetic variation and epigenetic variation. More on that to come. So where do orchids come from? Here's a guy with his newborn in a bassinet asking, so how do you want to play this, nature, nurture, or a bit of both? And it turns out that it almost always is a bit of both. There is clearly genetic variation that goes into the development of an orchid phenotype child. All of you know that our DNA is housed within this little nucleus within each of our cells. That DNA is organized into chromosomes. If those chromosomes were unraveled, and within one cell we unraveled all of the chromosomes within that cell, the length would be about 2 meters. So an extraordinary length of DNA packed within this little tiny nucleus in every single one of the cells in our body. And there is clearly evidence that genetic variation has some role in the forming of an orchid phenotype. But DNA is like books that are packed in boxes and stacked in a library. Those books have limitless potential to inform and inspire, but they need to be unpacked and read. It's the same with genes. They have to be unpacked in order to be read by the RNA polymerase, the enzyme that decodes the gene. So orchids come from both genes and environments. It is the environments that unpack those genes, allow them to influence the development of the brain, and it is clearly the case that neither genes nor environments alone are determinative of an orchid or a dandelion phenotype. Getting toward the end here now, and this is the most scientific challenge I'm going to put to you this evening. How do genes and environments work together? Stunningly, we now know a lot about how that actually happens, and it happens via the epigenome. The epigenome, as the name implies, is a matrix of chemical tags that lie on top of, like epidermis. We have the genome, which is indelible from the point of conception, half from your mom, half from your dad. It is the same for the entire lifespan of each of us. But what is not the same through the entire lifespan is this matrix of chemical tags that lie on top of the genome and influence the functioning and the regulation of those various genes. So here you can see, again, the chromatin, the chromosome unraveled. When it's unraveled, it looks like beads on a string. The DNA is the string, and the histone proteins are the beads. And it can either be loosely packed, like here, or tightly packed, like here. And that depends on whether there are these methyl and other chemical groups that tag various points on the DNA. Where does that come from? It is our environment that influences the tagging of these various points on the DNA that regulate up and down the expression of genes. When the DNA is accessible and loosely packed, the gene is active. When the DNA is inaccessible, the gene is inactive. So the environment has this ability to up or down regulate the expression of every gene that we have. So the epigenome, we believe now, is where the external world actually touches the biological self. We think that the epigenome is the actual nexus, the physical point of contact between genetic variation and environmental variation that really determines the health and development of each individual human being. We all know that our children are diverse, but we might ask the question, what allows an orchid child to thrive? What are the things that we think allow a child with this great sensitivity to thrive within a family or a classroom? And I've, in the book, outlined 6 different strategies which I think are key. Those are these. First, a sense of one's own true self. I believe that the ultimate purist goal of parenting is to discover and recognize who each individual child is, who that self is, and allowing that self to flourish and prosper. Routines and sameness. Orchid children love routines from day to day, week to week, month to month. They like the predictability of that kind of pattern to daily life. And by the way, I want to also just mark for you that these are all things that we have found clinically are extremely important to orchidish children, but they also are things that help dandelion children as well, just not as much. So these are things that orchids really need. Dandelions, maybe not so much, but they certainly don't hurt. Caritas, the Latin word for compassion and caring. All children need the attentiveness of their parents and that kind of steadfast, abiding love, knowing that that parent is there and is going to love them forever. Dandelion children surely need that, but orchid children need that in abundance. Human differences. There are families where the differences between children are obscured. We try to do away with as many differences as we can so that we can function as a family without having to have too many different kinds of menus to deal with. There are other families where human differences are celebrated and honored. That diversity is a valuable and cherished aspect of individual children. And those are the families where orchid children seem to thrive best. Imaginative play. We often can make the mistake of thinking that play is kind of frivolous, useless activity. It is not. It is the child's vacation from reality. It is the place within day-to-day life where children work out how to do social relationships with each other, how to deal with conflict, how to make a friend, what happens when somebody gets alienated, how do I make myself feel good about my life in the course of play. So imaginative play is key. And finally, and maybe the most difficult of these strategies, is how to deal with the phenomenon of danger. Every orchid child will have, sometimes relatively frequently, periods of time or events where they just want to withdraw, they want to run the other way. I mentioned an example of a birthday party where the child doesn't know many of the people coming to the birthday party. The parents of orchid children have this difficult, fine line that they have to walk between not allowing the child to withdraw from fearfulness and perceived endangerment, nudging that child on into trying something that the parent feels certain that the child can master and overcome, versus in other circumstances saying, you don't want to do that? You know what? You don't have to do that. Finding that fine line is really a difficult issue for the parents of orchid children. And remarkably enough, this forms a mnemonic of orchid. Wonder how that happened. So those 6 strategies are the things both for parents and for teachers and others who care for children that we have found clinically seem to be important to orchid children. So, summary, 3 points. The first is that children's health is not just affected by bugs and bad water. We now know that these psychological, emotional adversities, things like maltreatment, parent conflict, community violence, poverty, all of those things that we talk about as ACEs, can impair health and can even impede brain development. And children are not equally susceptible to those exposures. They fall seemingly into 2 broad categories of susceptibility: a majority that, like dandelions, thrive under most conditions, and a smaller minority that, like orchids, are especially sensitive to both good rearing conditions and bad conditions. And finally, that these differences in susceptibility are due to the combined developmental effects of genes and very early environments, even into intrauterine life, both nature and nurture. These arise epigenetically in this matrix of chemical tags that lie on top of the genome through environmental signals that regulate the expression of inherited genetic differences. So for me, these 2 deep themes of my life were clearly and obviously related. I'm telling you the truth that I did not discover until about 10 years ago that this deep current of my life was in any way related to this deep current of life. We sometimes have to discover things in our dotage. But it's been said that every photograph is a self-portrait, in the sense that everything we choose as a photographer to take a picture of is chosen because of something within us. There's something about that frame, that setting that we choose, and that was certainly the case in my own career. The answer to the why question probably has to do with unshared family environments. 2 siblings are raised in different families. I firmly believe that no 2 children are raised in the same family, quote unquote. Every child has a different experience of that family, even within a sibship. There may have been sibling differences in genetic risk between my sister Mary and me. There may have been differences that had to do with birth order or gender. And almost surely there were these epigenetic interactions between genetic variation between the 2 of us and the unshared family environmental variation. Last slide. I want to be sure that the last thing I tell you is the thing that I most want you to retain and remember. And that is the good news that is in this book. The good news is that the children about whom we as teachers or parents, child care providers, those children that we worry most about are sometimes those that actually have the most extraordinary promise. And under conditions of support and care, the troubled childhoods of some orchid children can be transformed into lives of exceptional help and remarkable accomplishment. Thank you for your great attention, and I'd love to take questions.